I'm about to do a presentation about an article that was published in The Way. Well, I'm not doing a presentation, but there's going to be a discussion about it. And so I've been thinking about what I was writing in terms of what might arise in the discussion. And one of the questions that's going to be discussed is John of the Cross, which the article's about, and basically discernment in spiritual direction, in the work that I do in spiritual direction and in the work I do in therapy as well. What does it mean to follow the heart? And this is what I think John of the Cross writes about all the time in his writing. It's what Jesus is talking about all the time in the Gospels, and how he exemplifies the behaviour of what it is to be human, fully human. And what are the practical implications of following the heart, following God? And in spiritual direction, one example is when you're sitting with, or in therapy, when you're sitting with another person, is not to just follow whatever comes into your head, but to really follow what comes into your heart, then head, from God. So sometimes someone might say something that I might have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to, or I might have a bit of advice or something helpful I think might be helpful to say. Or I might be annoyed. I might find something annoying. And so I'll, in each of those, anything like that, I will, if my immediate response isn't purely loving and feeling into what's being said, I'll take a moment. Where do we go with this? And the question in spiritual direction is always, where's God in this? And to answer that question is really to tune in with God in a prayerful way. We're often taught in training, spiritual direction training, where's God in this? It's one of the tutors described as that old chestnut, but it's a real question. It's just how do we approach it is the question, really. And I think how to approach it is to really tune in with God and listen. What does God actually say here? So you close your eyes and feel with compassion. What is the delicate and unique path that God wants to tread, that Jesus would tread if he embodied. We're embodied God on earth anyway ourselves, as Jesus exemplifies. With all his finesse, what would he say? And I'm really listening, because our knee-jerk reaction might be something that isn't helpful. You might feel helpful at the time, but it's not really doing God's work. I think John of the Cross talks about this all the time. So when I say in my article, it's a journey of the heart to the heart. It's about this kind of place of inhabiting through the inhabiting of love. We get more love. We bring more love into ourselves. This kind of bringing into the space that's already there, more love, and where it feels. So it's always going in and out, breathing in and out. And when I was, and none of that probably makes a lot of sense, but I don't know. But yeah, one other thing I wanted to say about John of the Cross, which might be or might not be connected, I'm not sure. in my training as a Carmelite, a lot of people talked about John of the Cross's analogies with weaning, with breastfeeding and weaning. Yeah, and I've been a breastfeeding mother, and I have trained as a breastfeeding support person as well. Got quite a lot of interest in this. So when I started as a mother, when I had my baby, I didn't know much about breastfeeding. I knew I wanted to breastfeed, but I thought that breastfeeding was something you did, and 6 months was quite a lot, and that was pretty good going. And then you weaned your child and you stopped the baby breastfeeding. I didn't really know much about it, but I assumed it would just kind of you stopped it and then they started eating solid food or whatever. And I watched a program on Channel 4, Channel 4 documentary called Extreme Breastfeeding, which at the time with my other mothers in my postnatal group, we all watched this because it was just on at the same time when we were all new mothers. So we were all pretty intrigued by it. And obviously it's quite shocking. Well, we found it quite shocking, Western mothers. We didn't really know anything about it. I don't think any of us did. And on that TV program, there was other mothers who had been breastfeeding their kids, up to the age of like 7, 5, 6, 7 years old. So these children were massive, especially in comparison with our tiny little babies. And I also remember actually being pregnant and showing up at a leisure centre one day, and before I had my child, and there was a woman sitting in the hallway, and she was breastfeeding her little child, who was quite a big baby, and I remember like bewildered looking at her and this big baby and saying to her, "He's so big," and she said to me, "Well, they do grow," and I felt, oh, well, yes, they do. I hadn't really realised what I was saying then was probably, he's very big to be feeding. Sort of didn't really think it, because I just didn't have the concept of full-term breastfeeding at all back then. I certainly did later on after watching this program about so-called extreme breastfeeding. I learned about full-term breastfeeding. I learned that the child can carry on feeding until they are kind of like ready to move on. And I obviously, at first, I just thought, wow, that's not for me. I probably thought that's not for me. That's kind of crazy. But as the months went on, it got to the 6th month mark, I really felt like it doesn't feel like the right time. I don't really feel a need to stop this. Didn't feel like there was any kind of coming to a natural pause or anything. And it just kind of kept on like that every month. I just carried on feeling like, it doesn't really feel like this is a time to stop. Don't really feel the need. And then at back sort of when my little one was 2 years old, I noticed that I think my breast milk was maybe drying up a little bit, wasn't needed enough, or there wasn't fulfilling my baby's needs. And so there was quite a demand, and I think it was quite hard work at that point, and I felt like giving up, and I got bitten, and it's kind of quite hard work and uncomfortable, and I felt like giving up. But I felt like it doesn't really feel like a good time to give up, because my child doesn't want to give up. He obviously needs it. So I carried on, and then there were times later on when it felt like perhaps he wanted to give up, and I felt sad about that. I sort of felt like I'm not ready to stop. And I felt that, I just noticed that going through me. And then as the months and years went on, so then he was sort of nearly 5 years old and about to start school. Um, and it was just dropping off slowly, 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 less feeding, maybe more like once a day or something. And it just stopped really naturally. And I noticed it was very nice, me and my child we both came to a natural conclusion. We're both ready. And it felt really healthy, really, really good. Like he'd had enough. I allowed him to come back whenever he needed, whenever he wanted. And I felt I'd satisfied his need, and that was a good feeling for me. It all felt really natural and good. In John of the Cross's discussion of breastfeeding and weaning, he has an analogy of God weaning us of the mother's milk by God's close parenting of us. And the withholding, but John sees it as the withholding of God's consolations as we mature in our faith. And that God, by withholding his consolations, he leads us into a more mature place in our faith. And that leads us into this dark night, which purges us of our childhood, our childishness, and which he considers a kind of inordinate appetite and spiritual gluttony that would otherwise go on forever. So we'd never want to take up solid food if we were given the chance to carry on having this sweet milk of our mother. And I think in his book, The Dark Night, this is very prevalent. But I don't agree with this analogy. And I think it's a good analogy, breastfeeding, but I don't actually, because I've had that experience as a mother, I don't actually think we need to force a child. I don't think the child does carry on wanting milk beyond, they don't just keep wanting to have this sweet milk. They naturally want to move on to the next thing. And it actually isn't, well, it doesn't need to be this kind of hellish, I don't know, dark, tortuous path where they're forced, they wouldn't choose to get off the path unless they were forced to get this lovely sweet path, unless they were forced to. Actually, it's just it comes very natural, and it's good. And I think God made us with these natural stages in our human development. They proceed from one to the next with mutual agreement without friction, and do that in God's good time. So I think it's a great analogy, but I think John gets it wrong. Or perhaps he sees it in terms of what often happens. And yes, even to this day, that often happens. It's a kind of bit of a battle between child and parent. Obviously, oftentimes mothers have other needs. They have to go back to work. Maybe they're forced back to work, or they really strongly desire to go back to work. All sorts of factors involved. Or whatever that means that it is a bit of we have to balance our needs situation, but there is a possibility where the needs are just balanced naturally, and I think that happens if things are left to their own devices. Whenever I went around as a parent, I don't think it's that uncommon, because I just think it's not known about that much, but whenever I went around say central London, I'd be on the tube breastfeeding. I'd be round and about places breastfeeding, and I'd oftentimes have mothers come up to me and say, "Oh, that's great. I breastfed my son till 4 years. I breastfed my child until they were 6, whatever." It happened quite a bit that I'd hear that, so I started to realize how normal this was. Which I wouldn't have known at all unless I was actually out there breastfeeding myself, because it's not so common. People don't get to know just how normal this is, and that's actually I think the average. Well, I think that extreme breastfeeding program said the average age of breastfeeding, the ending of breastfeeding throughout the world the average was something more like sort of 5 or 6 years old. And obviously the European average pulls it down quite a bit, but the worldwide average is quite a lot higher than we really realize, and that's just normal. And as a human being, I was like, that's normal. I didn't want my Western kind of prejudices or whatever to skew what was actually normal for humans and what was normal for the human animal to need to give their child. So I was really kind of up for hearing that and thinking, okay, learn from other cultures or learn how things are done outside of Europe. So I was quite keen to hear that and try it. And yeah, it worked out really well for me. So I think God's if the same with God, probably that God doesn't, we don't actually need to go into this kind of horrible dark place. I mean, oftentimes we do, and we need to because there's no alternative, because circumstances have kind of put us there. We've gone into hell, and it's and we wouldn't choose to. And that does purify us. But I would be interested to see how much of a hell we actually have to go through in order to be a successful human being. I mean, Jesus, obviously, he did go through hellish times, but his parents were very loving. He had a very loving family unit. Um, and he managed to reach a kind of enlightenment with God quite young. Kind of like 30, well, into I guess he would be like, well, I was developing all his life, but he was only 30, whatever, by the time he managed to go to his death on the cross, following love, following his path of love to its ultimate conclusion. And whereas a lot of us manage, perhaps have to take more decades than that to work through our issues. So perhaps, having a healthy family, having a healthy lack of obviously Jesus had issues. His mother was like accusing him of being insane and things, wanting him to get a lot of people didn't want him to get himself in the way of trouble, which he did. That was part of his calling. But I think Jesus, his path perhaps didn't sort of feel himself forced to come off the path of consolation. He left that family of origin. That was a very healthy family naturally. He didn't struggle to get away. And I think it may well be the same for any of us if things were left to their own devices, we didn't have all this kind of difficulty that does get thrown in, of course, in difficult family circumstances, abusive families, different things that would take us away from love, even workplaces or family relations where it doesn't feel things don't work out as we might ideally want them to. But yeah, and as for the picture there behind in the background of John, that's John the Evangelist by El Greco. I there's a lot to be said. This is John of the Cross for me, is kind of inhabiting this world where he sees all the darkness, because this darkness does exist. And I suppose John gives us advice for a world that is dark, where we do get forced out of our consolations, and we never grow naturally into we never sort of get all the love we need as a child like Jesus did, and then naturally move out of that into adulthood in a way of adult, mature relationship with God that really can listen all the time and not be fighting God or making decisions away from God. That perfection doesn't exist for most of us. And so then, and then we're in a hell where we see hellish stuff around us all the time, and we carry on living, and we carry on observing, and we carry on being love within that sort of tempestuous storminess that's behind John, his face, the pallor, the witnessing, the dark eyes. And in that painting, there's he's holding this chalice, which is the chalice someone gave him to murder him one day, full of poison. And it didn't kill him. And in a way that meant he carried on living. You know, that wasn't necessarily an easy thing. So you've got these kind of dual paths. There's the one path, Jesus's path, which I really believe we can reach. And I think with one thing I really enjoy is Jean Liedloff's book, The Continuum Concept I think it's in Search of Paradise Lost, talking about the Aquana Indians who kind of found this loving way when they create inventions that hurt one of their tribe. They smash it up because they don't see it as more important to have technological progress than actually hold each other in love. So an example of that is that Jean Ludloff witnessed was a father who'd made a playpen for his son, and it was made out of like sticks or whatever. It was like a little classic kind of playpen with bars, and they put the baby in, and the baby was bewildered at first and looked around and was kind of, well, this is new. It was a new invention for the tribe. But quite soon the baby realized it couldn't get out. The little one was like trying to get out and couldn't get out and started screaming. And Jean Liedloff witnessed this father immediately running to the child. You know, at first he thought it might be a good idea to put the child there. The child can't wander off. He can get on with some work. Just the same kind of thoughts that we might have as adults in our own society. But the father immediately saw the child crying, immediately ran to the child, picked him out of the playpen and put him down back in freedom, and smashed up the playpen, just completely broke it to pieces. And she said that what emerges from that is the fact that that's why they don't have technological advances like what we do, not because they're inferior to us, but because they put other things first. And maybe that's something that we maybe should have done a long time ago. You know, maybe the first time a car hit a child and killed someone, we should have said this invention, nothing can be worth this. The first time a car hit an animal and left it dead, we should have perhaps said, we could have perhaps said, is it worth it? Is anything worth this? Is this car worth this? Can it be worth what this murder is, this death, bringing death into the world? Each thing that brings death into the world, we can ask ourselves, is it worth it? And we are so steeped in that now. We're very far from being able to really escape, even if we really want to. It's impossible to live a life outside of that now, from probably for pretty much anyone on this planet. So we then have to witness. We're then in the place of being witnesses, anyone who can. But I do believe it is possible to live a different way. And I think that anthropologists like Jean Liedloff show us that. And that's worth knowing, that it isn't something, it's not like this is human. I don't believe this is human nature that we can't escape from, that has to be, that we have to go through hell. The fact that we are doing that again and again, and that we are digging ourselves deeper and deeper into this, into hell, so much so that it's impossible to live in a way that isn't harming anyone else, doesn't actually mean, well, it does mean it's impossible, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's impossible at the same time. In our hearts, we can find a different way. And I think Jesus comes in like quite radical, tearing it all down. You know, we're not compromising here with Jesus. We're living a very different path. And even if that's just witnessing, like John the Evangelist in this painting here, even if we're just witnessing, if that's all we got, then that's what we do. Yeah, so just to sort of counter that, the idea that breastfeeding, this small act of one mother and child, that it has to end in a hellish separation of of a fight between what the child wants and what's good for the child. No, I don't agree. I think what the child wants and what's good for the child happen in their own time. And I think that's a really important message for therapy and spiritual direction. We don't have to force anyone into anything. God works. God holds it all. God set it all up in place, in play, and works it all through, and it happens. It just happens. It unfolds, and we can let it. We can like try to stand back and see the power of God every time. Stand back prayerfully here. Okay, my way is very crass and unloving and uncompassionate, and I'm not really seeing insights, not very insightful. But God brings that in, so we can stand back. We pray and we hear from God, and we find a different way through, a unique, clever path through, like Jesus escaping from the crowds of people who want to push him off a cliff. He finds his way through and he gets away. Or like Jesus, when the Pharisees say, does your master pay the tax, the whatever the tax is? Yeah, yes, he does. Jesus says, go and get the coin from the mouth of the fish. And or he says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus finds these ways through where he's not compromising himself and he's not going against his truth and honor, but he is finding his way through complicated worldly setups which we can stumble at, and we have to do the same. We can stumble in these challenges, but God always have a path through. He always has some path through that is of God. He's found a way, so we really need to tune into what that is. Even in the deepest depths of hell, like John the Evangelist, like saints like John of the Cross who've been imprisoned and are being tortured. We just need to find the ways of God, and we need to do that by prayer. Thanks for listening. And I'd be appreciative of any thoughts and responses. Bye.